Hello, I'm Graham and I hope everyone's having a great day. Welcome to part 3 of my user's guide to the Panasonic Lumix FZ2000 or 2500 bridge camera. Now, for sake of clarity, I'm just going to call this the FZ2000 throughout the video. Now, in part 2 we looked at shooting in the IA mode and we saw that we got some great photographs using the IA mode, but there are some severe limitations for creative control. For example, we only had the two photo styles of colour and black and white, and there's no control within them. We were totally reliant on the camera scene detection to get the right scene to give us the right result. 99 times out of 100 it will give you the right result, but it doesn't give you any creative control. That's why I suggested we move on to the semi-automatic modes of the program auto, aperture priority and shutter priority, and those are the three that I want to look at in today's video. Now, the program auto mode is the most logical step to move forward from you shooting in fully automatic. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you're shooting in program auto mode or aperture priority or shutter priority. The end result, if you've got the same settings, will give you the same exposure. Remember, in photographic science we only have the three controls to deal with when we want to create an image, and that is going to be the aperture, which will govern the amount of depth of field, the foreground to background sharpness in your image, shutter speed, which will control the amount of subject motion blur, and the ISO, which controls the overall gain or sensitivity of the camera to light. Now, normally we'll lock down the ISO to the lowest or native ISO of the camera to give us the widest dynamic range and the lowest noise. So if we lock the ISO down to 125 in this case with this camera, we're left with aperture and shutter speed to create our exposure. So it's really just a case of whether you want depth of field or you want to control subject motion blur are the two choices. If you are moving up from intelligent auto mode, program auto is a good place to start because it gives you an opportunity of capturing images on the fly. You don't have to think about it, your camera will just take the picture. It won't be reliant on scene detection to get the exposure right. It's reliant on the exposure metering circuit and other controls such as the highlight and shadow that you might have set in the camera, but we'll talk about those as we go through the actual video itself. Now, in terms of program auto, the camera will use first of all your photo style setting, and we've got quite a few now available when we switch to these semi-automatic modes. We've got the standard one, we've got a vivid, we've got a portrait, landscape, natural. We've got quite a few controls there we can actually use to enhance our pictures, create different moods, different looks. And within each of those photo styles we've got the opportunity to change the parameters. So for example, in a low contrast light situation we might want to use the contrast control to boost the contrast in our JPEG out of camera image. We've also got control over the amount of sharpness and noise reduction. So in some instances it's nice to put a little bit of extra sharpening onto your image and reduce the noise reduction to give you a better out of camera JPEG if you didn't want to be bothering with doing a lot of external editing in your editing programs. Now, the photo style settings are very much personal settings, and it's best to use a standard scene that you shoot regularly and just play around by adding a little bit of sharpness and a little bit of noise reduction. Keep a note of what you've put for each particular image, then preview them and see which is the best result. In a later video I'll show you how you can use the raw mode of the camera and the internal processing of this camera to find out how to set those individual controls without having to post-process them or take multiple images. So I'll be showing you that in a later video. Let's start now by looking at the program auto mode, what it gives you, how to set it up, and what are the caveats that are involved if you are shooting in the P mode. So I'm going to set up for this woodland scene here. The sun keeps going in and going out. When the sun's out there's some nice shadows being cast through these trees here, which is quite a nice image. But at the moment the sun's gone behind some clouds. Fortunately it's not raining, so that's a bonus for me today. So we'll just shoot with what conditions we've got, and I hope to demonstrate within the video that if I set up in program auto mode and capture an image with a particular set of parameters, if I've used those same parameters in either the aperture priority mode or the shutter priority mode, the end image is always the same. You're not going to change it by using aperture priority, shutter priority or program auto. The exposure is going to be the same. So let me turn the camera around and set up to do this woodland scene, and I'll take you through some of the exposures that we'll be taking today. Now I've set the camera up on a tripod so I can keep the same shot for each of the modes that we want to talk about. At the moment I've got the camera, as you can see, set to the IA Plus mode, and if I just briefly depress the shutter button, you can see the camera has chosen an aperture of f2.8 and 1/60th of a second. We're in the IISO mode, as we saw in the video of part 2, and we only find out what the ISO has been if we take the picture, and we can see that that is ISO 250. Now for this particular application we want as much depth of field as we can get, and even though this is a 1-inch sensor, which is quite small by comparison to full frame, we won't get the amount of depth of field that we need for this particular shot. So I want from the foreground here all the way through to the very last tree there to be sharp. So I would want to select an aperture of something like f5.6 to f8 with this particular camera. So what I'm going to do first of all is now go into the program auto mode, and of course I'll do that by turning the top mode dial until the P aligns to the white mark on the flash housing. That's indicated also on the LCD by the fact that we've got the P appearing on the screen. Again, when I depress the shutter button halfway down, you see the camera has again chosen a aperture of f2.8 with a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second and the ISO of 125. So that is still going to give me a reasonable picture, and in fact I'll take that and we can have a look at that in the video. And then we will now look at how to move this to something like f5.6 to give me the conditions that I want to take this particular shot. Now there are a couple of caveats, and you can easily fall into this trap if you want to use something like the auto ISO or the intelligent ISO mode that the camera exhibits. So first of all we'll talk about using a fixed ISO, which is what I would normally recommend anyway. So you want to use ISO 125. Now I want to achieve a aperture of about f5.6. So once you depress the shutter button, and then within the next 10 seconds, if you turn the top control dial to the left, you'll see that we bring up the aperture and shutter speed, and you notice that the indicator here has now gone to a P with a double-headed arrow, and that means we're in the program shift mode. And I can set the aperture to what I want. So if I wanted to go all the way down to f11, which is the smallest aperture that the FZ2000 has, then you can change that. But you then run into what's called diffraction limited resolution, and the images become a little softer. So you want to be staying between f5.6 and f8 to give you the best results. So I'm going to go for f6.3, which is a third of a stop over the f5.6. And now you can see that the shutter speed is 1/8 of a second. The fact that the camera is on a tripod is no bother. Now it's showing me that we've got a handshake warning on the screen. You can probably just see there's a red image appearing on the LCD screen, which is a camera shake warning icon. Now Panasonic recommend that you turn the stabilizer off if you've got the camera on a tripod. So I'm going to turn it off, but in practicality terms I've not noticed any difference if I forgot to turn that off. I've not seen any double image shake or anything like that, because the OIS has tried to compensate for something that really isn't happening. So I've just turned it off, and you'll get the hand notification here to remind you that you're in a situation where the optical image stabilizer has been turned off. So now we've got the situation under control that we want. We've got the aperture set to f6.3 and the ISO down at ISO 125. You notice that I've got a small rectangle, which is my focus point. And again, you can change the focus point to where you want on the screen by using the touch control. And to get the most depth of field, we'll use what's called a hyperfocal distance. And that means we set the focus to about a third of the way into the image. So I'm going to select a third of the way into the image, which is roughly where that tree is there, that bendy tree. So with that focus point set, and I have to press the shutter button, it will lock the focus, and then I can take the picture by fully depressing the shutter button. If I wanted to ensure there's no camera shake, of course, I could dial in that 2-second timer. So the camera has now taken that image at f6.3, 1/6 of a second, ISO 125. Now, I did mention the fact we've got more control in the semi-automatic mode, and if you press menu set and you go to page 1 of the record setup screen, and I can use the zoom lever to quickly change to page 1, you notice we've got the first indication here of a photo style which can actually change the values. So we get contrast, sharpening, noise reduction, saturation and color tint. So contrast is left to 0. For my JPEGs, I'm normally shooting with a slightly increased sharpness of +2 and a slightly decreased noise reduction of -2. But these are personal settings. If you leave them at 0, fine, you can make the adjustments in your image editing program anyway. And if you shoot RAW at the same time as JPEG, then at some point in time when you become more familiar with image processing, you can come back and edit those RAW files and get the result that you really want. So I've got the camera set up to record both JPEG and RAW, so we can actually do that in a later video. You notice if we go into photo styles and we go to the top, we've got control of standard, vivid, natural, monochrome, scenery, portrait, and then the custom where you can set the program as you want it. So we'll go back to the standard mode. We'll take that shot again. Now the program shift will stay operational. Even if I go to the aperture priority mode and come back to the program mode, you'll notice that the program shift remains set. So if I just have to press the shutter button again, you'll notice that we've still got our aperture set to f6.3, which is the same as having your aperture priority mode with your aperture set to f6.3. Now I did say there were some caveats if you are using the program auto mode, and one of them is in the ISO. So if I just select ISO and instead of having the fixed ISO of 125, if I go to auto ISO, then if I just cancel the program shift, and you do that by just rotating the dial until you clear the P with the double-headed arrow. So in the program shift mode using auto ISO, the camera will change both ISO and aperture. So be aware that if you want to go from say f2.8 to f4, you might go in that increment in your aperture, but it may change the ISO as well, as you can see is happening on the screen at the moment. Now if you try to use the ISO mode, which you normally can use in things like manual, you'll find that you can't achieve the program shift. So if I have to press the shutter button and then within 10 seconds I turn the top control dial and I don't get any program shift operation. You can't achieve program shift with ISO. You can only do that in the auto ISO or in a fixed manual ISO. So those are the things to watch for if you are trying to follow along and find you can't get the program shift icon. Now let's look at the aperture priority mode, and the aperture priority mode is exactly the same. Now the back control dial will change the aperture, and the front control dial, if you've got it programmed, will change the exposure value compensation. So I'm going to change the aperture to the f6.3 that we had for program shift, and the ISO I'm going to set down to ISO 125 that we had in the previous example, and we've got the same exposure around about a 1/6 of a second, f6.3. So we'll take that picture again with the same photo style of scenery with the adjustment made to it, and the same aperture and the same ISO, and the actual image will be the same as the one created in program shift. So we'll use aperture priority when we want to govern the amount of depth of field, and that amount of depth of field will vary with the aperture size. The larger the aperture, the shallower the depth of field, and the smaller the aperture, the more depth of field you've got. Let's look at shooting in the shutter priority mode, and again, if you turn the mode dial until the S appears across the white indicator mark, you'll see that you've got S on the LCD screen. That means now we can control the shutter speed by turning this back control dial. You notice on the exposure indicator you will get a red indication if the camera will be outside its control range if you try to go into that zone. So you couldn't set a 60th of a second at f2.8. You'll notice that the camera will blink the red aperture and shutter speed to warn you that you're going to get an exposure which will be out of control. So you would normally dial in here a shutter speed that you would want for your particular application. So for example, if you were taking sports indoors and you wanted to capture images without any subject motion blur, then you might want to be using, say, a shutter speed of a 250th of a second. Now, if we're using this aperture of f2.8, you notice we've got a red indication. So the only way I can get the exposure and get it correct without this indication of being out of range will be the fact that I'll have to change my ISO. So I'm going to change the ISO to something like 400, and we'll check now. So we're still outside control. If I change the ISO again, we'll go to 1000. We're now in control. We're using a 250th of a second at f3.5. So that's the process you would go through if you're going to be shooting indoors and you're shooting, say, a sports event. First of all, set your shutter speed and then see what the camera aperture is and adjust the ISO until you've got the camera into range. So I could take this picture now if I wanted this with a 250th of a second, and we'll be using ISO 1000. So there will be a little bit more noise in the image because we're using that much higher ISO. Now don't forget, this camera doesn't have a constant aperture lens, so when I set the aperture to f2.8, say, in aperture priority mode, if I start to zoom in, the camera will change the aperture as we start to zoom in, and say at 38 millimeters already the f2.8 has gone to f3.3, so we've lost a little bit of light gathering quality from our lens. And if you go all the way to the full 480 millimeters effective focal length, you notice the lens has lost one stop, so we've gone down to f4, or a stop and a third really. So be aware that if you are using full zoom, you've lost a stop of light, so you might have to increment your ISO to capture the same images. So let's go back to ISO 125. We'll take the aperture up to f11 just to see just how much softening we get from diffraction and limited resolution. Again, we're focusing on the same point of the image, which is going to be this tree. So let's take that picture. Now the other things you'll notice that you've got control of are things like your aspect ratio, which you've got in Intelligent Auto mode. The quality we've got set to RAW plus JPEG, so I've still got these RAW files I can edit at a later date if I wanted to. We'll talk about the focus modes in the next video, where we can switch between autofocus single and autofocus flexible. Autofocus single will just take the image and lock focus when you press the shutter button halfway down. In the AFF mode, the camera will still attempt to focus on a subject that's moving, even though your shutter button is halfway down. Metering mode is an important factor, and we'll be looking at that when we talk about the manual mode. We can actually change from whole area, center weighted, or spot. We can change those to reflect on the subject type we're taking, but normally you would leave that into the whole area mode. Burst mode is the rate at which the camera will fire off subsequent images, and we'll be looking at that. Auto bracketing, again, we'll be looking at that in the next video. The highlight and shadow, again, I'm going to leave until we talk about the manual mode, and we can introduce some other control into our image. The eye dynamic and eye resolution are ways that the Panasonic tried to increase the dynamic range and the sharpening in the image by some post-processing that happens within the JPEG, but I don't use those. I'm going to leave them off, and I recommend that you leave those off as well. Multiple exposure we'll talk about later. Now the shutter type is default auto, but you can actually set it to a manual shutter or an electronic shutter if you wanted to work in a silent environment. But using the electronic shutter restricts your operational range of shutter speed, and there is some suggestion that you lose some dynamic range. So under normal circumstances, I'll shoot in the manual mode and I have no problems. Flash we'll be talking about later. The ISO increments normally are set to 1 EV increments, but I changed these to a third, so I've got finer control of the aperture and shutter speed when we're setting those in aperture and shutter priority. And extended ISO, I don't use those ridiculous high ISOs. If you need to capture an image in that sort of light, good luck to you with the amount of grain that you're going to get. Long shutter noise reduction, for anything more than 1 second the camera will apply long shutter noise reduction to try and reduce the amount of noise that's in the image. Diffraction compensation, leave that on auto. It means that the camera will attempt to add extra sharpening as you move up the aperture range to overcome that diffraction limited resolution. You'll notice that iZoom and digital zoom are actually greyed out, and that's because we've got RAW set. If you turned off RAW, you'll open up the opportunity to use iZoom and digital zoom. The iZoom will give you up to ×2 digital magnification. It's cropping into the image and then interpolating that back to the full size of the image format. So it is a digital gain rather than an optical one, so you will lose some resolution, irrespective of Panasonic saying you don't lose any image quality. Stabilizer we've seen is off for this particular mode. And face recognition we talked about briefly in the IA mode, where you can actually recognize faces and set them into your database. Profile is for the babies and for pets. We'll talk about some of the other features you can turn on and change in a later video, as this video will get too long if we go through every single menu operation. So there is the program auto, aperture priority and shutter priority modes, and the way that you can set them up and use them in your own creative photography styles. Well, that's it for part 3 of this user's guide, and I hope you find some of the information useful. If you are a new viewer and you like what you see, please do click the subscribe button and the bell notification icon, and you'll be notified when I upload the next video in this series. Also, check out my photographic blog, and I'm going to put a link to that in the video description below. You'll find lots more information on camera systems, photographic science, equipment reviews, and hints and tips, etc. And on the home page is the invitation to join my newsletter group, and that's a 3-weekly newsletter, which is in fact more than a newsletter. It's a technical publication in its own right, and it's information that I don't normally publish on the blog, and it's a way of saying thank you for subscribing to the newsletter. So please do check that out if you're not already a subscriber. So until the next video, where we'll be looking at shooting in the manual mode and an introduction to shooting video with this camera, I wish to say thanks very much for watching. Please do take care, and I hope to see you all in my next video. Goodbye for now.